This is the third and the final session. We have two panelists, two speakers. The first is Dr. Christine Dewan, or Kristen Dewan, fellow senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, where she heads the Division of Politics, Society, and Culture. She's received a PhD from Harvard University. Her expertise lies in Gulf states and societies. Has written and been cited in publications including Foreign Affairs, New York Times, Financial Times. She was previously an assistant professor at the American University School of the International Service and has held visiting scholar position at the Georgetown University and George Washington University. Her current projects concern generational change, nationalism, and evolution of Islamism in the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Each speaker will have about 20 minutes. The topic of Dr. Christian's presentation is Tribes and Citizenship, a critical reflection based on Khaldun al-Naqeeb's writing. You have لديك 20 دقيقة. شكرا دكتور أمل.
To all of you, especially Dr. Ibrahim and the others at the center for inviting me. Sorry, I'm going to give the lecture in English. أنا بحكي عربي على فكرة بس صعب شوي المحاضرة يعني بالعربي. So when I was told about this symposium, I knew right away that I really wanted to do it because Khaldun al-Naqeeb is somebody that's really been a formidable presence in shaping my thinking about the Gulf. I was able to meet him when I very first came to Kuwait as a young scholar, sit down and talk with him. Later to go and to read his books, to get into some of his oeuvre. I haven't gone as far as many of you, of course. Not many of his works have been translated. I've gotten into some of them, but not as in depth as you have. But I think, especially for somebody that was just starting out in the Gulf region, it was so helpful to have someone like him as a guide in thinking about things. And I think it's helpful for me to be here for no other reason, just to express that fact that there are many foreign scholars that have also delved into his work, and to give it from my perspective as a foreign scholar, because obviously we have different kind of challenges in trying to engage in the Gulf region. And so to have a guide like him has been really important to myself, and I know that Claire Beaugrand was also perhaps going to be here. She's done some really impressive work as well, and I know that she's also relied very much on his work. When you look at Western scholars, or I'll just speak for myself, because I guess this isn't everyone, we tend, at least initially in come here with a lot of preconceived impressions about the Gulf region. No matter what you say, and I'm somebody who learns Arabic and that sort of thing, this mental image of the desert and of tribes and tribalism is really powerful and very strong. And there's definitely a certain kind of exoticism or romanticism that foregrounds one's thinking and tends to place these kind of politics as sort of outside of normal politics. And I think that isn't really helped by the fact that outside scholars tend to initially, of course, find their grounding in the Gulf region and stuff in the cities and the urban settings and amongst usually kind of more liberal interlocutors too. And we don't associate that image with also the idea, higher, okay. Do I need to get closer or further? We don't associate that image with tribes, although even as we, as all of you know, these are also, we can also talk about the qabil in these settings too. And also a lot of those interlocutors tend to offer viewpoints which may reinforce certain prejudgments. So I think, like I said, Khaldun al-Naqeeb's work was really an antidote to that, basically Orientalism and limited thinking. And I think especially his approach, which is we've seen in full scope today, with everybody coming at it from all of these different viewpoints and critical views of his scholarship, it definitely makes sense, because I think when he's trying to analyze the society that he comes from, he's really, and I took a quote from his first book, he's looking at a dynamic matrix of the socioeconomic structure, political forces, and the distinguishing characteristics of social relationships prevailing in the Gulf. And I want to just highlight some of the insights that he gave to me that have been quite generative to my thinking at different times throughout my career, and helping me to overcome these particular pitfalls. As I mentioned, I think the whole idea of tribe, or as we're going to talk about tribalism too, is something that comes with a rather kind of crude imagery of what this actually means, and that extends also in terms of even when we look at scholarship, and particularly Western scholarship, which I think was mentioned, which also tends to be sort of an overemphasis on ethnographic work, looking at sort of tribal names and relations, which are not wrong per se, and sometimes those can be very useful resources, but it often just lacks that context, right? In particular, to understand these deeper understandings of patterns of global economic integration and social change and how that interacts. So I think when I first came, and even after reading some literature, I always made this really sharp distinction between economic patterns of life in the cities, if you're looking at like Kuwait City, and even in like early modern history, and then sort of, through pearl diving and all of the urban activities that are surrounding with that. And then when I saw sort of more nomadic living, like out there in the outer areas. And it's kind of through Dr. al-Naqeeb's writings that those sharp distinctions started to become much more rich and nuanced, thinking about, the centers of power in the region and this early modern history, Basra, Siraf, Hormuz, Muscat, in the south, Aden, Jeddah, Hab, and looking at then agricultural sectors with cottage industry production, more pastoral economy of the semi-desert, and then subsistence economies in inland areas and coastal villages. So just getting a better idea of the complexity of the economy was incredibly useful. And then I think, as you've all kind of referenced, he has more of a structural approach that I guess is informed by a certain Marxism or something that really, it's the economic shift and change over time that's driving a lot of the dynamism. And I think even in examining those early periods, you're getting to a sort of periodization and understanding how these things interact and the dynamic interactions between urban and these other areas through commerce. And this works both outward, of course, the growth of sort of the coastal mercantile cities, interacting with kind of global metropoles, and then inward, generating these kind of main tribal alliances and strategic cities and towns of the hinterland. And I think that last point is key, because when I became more informed and appreciative of historical trading patterns, and started to see kind of the much broader embrace of the Arabian Peninsula, going all the way from India, Persia, east coast of Africa, even onto the Euphrates Valley, the Levant, then you can start to understand the critical role that tribes have played historically in connecting these wider global networks. And that tribes and tribal elite and tribal alliances, play this main role of facilitating that trade or protecting sort of that trade, or taxing, of course, at the same time. But they were really essential, basically, for that traffic of men and goods. And then, of course, it was the tribal alliances in that key relationship with political rulers that often determined the rise and fall in power of power centers in early modern Iraq or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. So I think just to get that general setting was a little bit richer view of that was very important. And he was even more critical to me, I think, in trying to understand contemporary politics, because of course then you have to move from that sort of understanding to a new economic period that's much more mediated by the by the state and by the oil state. And I think that's something that we've all been sort of wrestling with as this sort of economic periodization, how to conceive of those, and at these shifts and what that does to tribes and emerging tribalism within the state. I think just having that early meeting, being fortunate enough to meet with him very early, as well as with others. We have other Kuwaiti scholars here who were extremely helpful in shaping my thinking, made me think much more about this whole question of that integration within the state, within the ruling family, with urban elite and their response or not response to political demands, legitimate demands that were made through either social coalitions or through parliament, and how that could be determinative of the struggle, the political struggle between the ruling elite and the opposition forces. And I think that's something important. We've all been, I've heard kind of in a lot of the presentations, a presentation that Dr. al-Naqeeb thought that tribes are sort of an impediment to democracy or something, and I guess this is a point you're making with tribalism, because I really think that he saw that these different social coalitions, the role of parliament also important, would be actually critical. That political struggle was going to be very critical to basically allowing for a greater degree of a popular transformation and liberation. So in that sense, it wasn't necessarily an impediment, but looking at the dynamics and interrelationship between all of these different social forces. I think that's particularly interesting to think about today, as the issue of sort of tribe and state are really critical ones, particularly in Kuwait, and to with the temporary suspension of the parliament right now and the amendment of citizenship laws, which Dr. Najjar mentioned. And of course, there's other sort of similar challenges going on between citizenship and political rights in other areas across the Gulf states. So I think that that also speaks to something else that I've been thinking about, that I think Khaldun al-Naqeeb's work and keeping that still central focus on the global forces and that global interaction have been really helpful to me, because I think it's very easy, as Dr. Al-Kandari said, to kind of look at each of these in specificity and say, oh, but it's different in each of these things. But when we look globally at the way that these dynamics are playing out, we see that there are like similar challenges, though. They look different in each state. But I think that sort of variation is an invitation for us to push towards deeper analysis and to try to think about why are those causes of differences, and to see where those differences could tell us about these shapes. And I think especially even not to limit it and to see, again, like the sort of tribalism or something that's very foreign, that can't be understood. I can see that there's extremely similar dynamics, even when I look at my own country in the United States, and we were just talking about this. There's something happening right now in this sort of later stage of capitalism that's really informed by, information systems, new sort of technology, perhaps the shifting in the global order too, and power centers, that seems to be putting a real premium on more centralized leadership. And I think we see that playing out. And it's especially affecting, I think, more democratic societies. We're seeing much more political polarization, and we're seeing, real challenges of sort of populism and nationalism in these places. And I think having a better understanding of the placement of tribalism within Kuwait can really help me to see that those are very similar dynamics, actually, to what I would see in the United States. Even some of these kind of populist things, that rhetoric that I hear from candidates, I hear them in the United States as well. And so it invites us, I think, to have this more universal perspective that Dr. al-Naqeeb gave to us at that time. Just one other comment, and I don't know, because I don't know his over as much as the rest of you, but I found in my own work, I don't think, and I think perhaps my co-panelist is going to talk about this too. One thing that I found really useful in trying to wrestle with these issues especially dealing with a more economic understanding of change and transformation, or this kind of structural transformation, is to wrestle much more with these ideas of status, which are complicated and they're not easily explained by economic forces. It's a different power altogether. And so I think for me, looking at some of the French scholars, someone like Bourdieu, who really looks at issues of social capital, cultural capital, looks at different spheres or fields of influence, can be a sort of helpful antidote or an additional way of analysis in trying to come to terms. And especially when you see the loss of social capital, for instance, with tribes that had huge, enormous prestige, and then in a new economic order, a new rearrangement of things, really lose that and what that means. So that's something else that I found really helpful. So I think I'll stop there, and I welcome your comments and questions.
المتحدث الثاني.
Our second speaker is Dr. Azzuddin Al-Farra from Morocco, and he is a professor of philosophy. He got his PhD from Fez University. His research interest focus on the state, colonialism, and he has a number of papers published in his name at Umran, Idafat, Journal of Social Sciences, Kuwait, Journal of Culture, Malaysia. Soon a book will be published by the Arab Center on colonial borderland society, economy and identity. And he will also be writing about Khaldun, Naqeeb and the Palestinian question. Thank you, Dr. Amal. Thank you to the Arab Center. And thank you to the Gulf Studies Unit. My intervention, like Dr. Amal has said, will be focusing on Khaldun and Naqeeb from two points of view, from an epistemological view in which he built his scientific work, and also I'll be focusing on the Palestinian question and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and to what extent was this is this present in Khaldun and Naqeeb's writings. My presentation will focus on, first of all, on an introduction and a general context, and then I will list the aims and objectives of this paper before I move to Khaldun and Naqeeb and the Arabian Gulf Society and Arabian Peninsula, and secondly the Khaldun and Naqeeb's perspective so far as the Arab-Israeli conflict is concerned, and I'll focus on the 1967 setback and then the Gulf Wars as an extension of the defeat of 1967, then the first and second Palestinian intifadas and resistance in Lebanon, and finally what some authors wrote about, like Az-Za'bi, who tackled Khaldun and Naqeeb's work. Finally, I'll have some critical observations on Khaldun and Naqeeb's writings in view of the events that took place after his death. So his work is a continuation of the interest in the Gulf region of Khaldun al-Naqeeb's work, which in 2012 Al-Owais Institute and Kuwait University, also they in 2022 have organized seminars on Khaldun al-Naqeeb's work to revive the role and the contribution of Khaldun al-Naqeeb. And 2024, a book was published about this. Then comes this seminar, which we gathered here this morning to celebrate Khaldun al-Naqeeb's work. So therefore, through my literature review, I noticed that some aspects of his knowledge production was ignored, especially when it comes to epistemological roots of his theory or methodology, and how he has applied this in the constructivism that he adopted in his work. I will also try to analyze Khaldun al-Naqeeb's work as a sociologist, and he was, after all, engaged in a debate with other researchers, especially Western ones, and he criticized them because they depicted the Gulf region in a condescending way, and also through his dialogue with his Arab colleagues, with the likes of Halim Barakat, and also he criticized other writers, for example, Samir Amin, and when he talked about development and the economy. And some of the aims I'm trying to achieve here is the ideas that Naqeeb has presented with an attempt to determine the positioning of the Palestinian conflict and all of this, and his position vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli conflict, and in this chronic conflict, as Ben Gurion puts it, because he doesn't think it's solvable in the foreseeable future. And Ben Gurion says that that the Arab countries should engage in a strategic alliance with non-Arab powers. Anyway, in 1987, the first edition of this book, and this is his first book. The second book is on the authoritarian state in the Arab Orient. Then Khaldun al-Naqeeb started publishing with As-Saqi Publishing House in London, which published 3 books for him, which are essential in my analysis. First on tribalism and the struggle between tribalism and democracy, and Dr. Ghanem focuses on that because he focused on tribalism and democracy, as we said. Then 1997, there's another important book which gives a summary of what Khaldun al-Naqeeb has noticed in his analyses regarding his book views on the jurisprudence of backwardness or stagnation, Arabs and the West in the age of globalization. And in 2002, I think this book was published, which includes his views on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And Naqeeb has presented deep scientific explanations of the questions of society, state in the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula. And he doesn't stop at analyzing this, but he provides solutions also through a comprehensive view of giving a priority to the whole and not the individual elements. And then this is the basis of his methodology, which is apparent in different works, like when he says the Arabian Peninsula area has a spirit or a soul which speaks for itself, and it manifests itself in different aspects. And also in his book, at the beginning, there was the struggle or the conflict, and he notices that there are many studies on Arab societies, but we do not know exactly how these institutions are linked to each other to provide the complete community or society. We only know this as parts and not a complete comprehensive. So constructivism is apparent in the work of Khaldun and Naqeeb, and especially when it comes to social change and through different historical phases, when based on this, and Naqeeb will conclude some sort of a typology of the different aspects of social change in the Arab societies. He provides an introduction first, and then Naqeeb criticizes first the ready-made perception which refers our societies to a Marxist kind of model of analysis, as if the Arab society does not have a structure of its own. And he also criticizes Max Weber and other writers, Eric Wolf, who studies Saudi Arabia. And so he takes these models have failed in explaining the Arab societies and how they are different than the European societies. So he proposes his own model, which is better for analysis than the ready-made model which is imported from the West so far as social change is concerned. I don't have enough time to delve into that. I'll move to the Arab-Israeli conflict and how the constructive methodology is present. The Arab-Israeli conflict from the point of view of al-Naqeeb, and focuses on the Arab society's relations to the state, and especially after the defeat of 1967, when a series of events have formulated as a result of the setback of June 1967 defeat. So this conflict, according to al-Naqeeb, has paralyzed the Arabs' ability to move for more than 1 century. And this situation of stagnation, and al-Naqeeb moves to other conflicts, and what the mother of all defeats, according to Abdul Wahab al-Effendi, the Iran-Iraq war, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the so-called Second Gulf War, and the first Palestinian Intifada, and the second Palestinian Intifada in 2000. So according to al-Naqeeb, regarding the 1967 defeat, this defeat, which is known as this setback, is a turning point in contemporary Arab studies. And Naqeeb says that this overwhelming defeat appears as a series of as one in a series of defeats from 1916, especially after the Sykes-Picot agreement, but it was in fact a new turning point, and similarly to the way the current Gaza war is looked at as a turning point at the regional level. And also it's an indication at the regional and international level. At the regional level, the defeat of 1967 has led the Arab pan-nationalist movement to lose its, as he terms, its ideological virginity, and pushes the criticism to Jamal Abdel Nasser personally, whom he blames for the defeat of 1967. Also at the regional and international level, because 1967 was a resounding victory for Zionism and Israel, compared to the Arab backwardness and stagnation and defeat. And international Zionism, in his opinion, has managed to achieve many successes, like turning the image of a Jewish person as a mythical champion after a long time in living in humility and in ghettos, and then turning also Israel from a country which is usurping the lands of others to a peaceful lamb, and also turning the Holocaust into something which cannot be discussed in an objective way, and also the final solution by Nazism, and how international Zionism blackmails the world if anybody attempts to understand or criticize the Holocaust.
I move on to Gulf War, which is deemed by al-Naqeeb as an extension of the 1967 defeat. When he analyzed the situation from the constructive approach, he found out that the Iraqi-Iranian war is another side of the same coin, the Palestinian cause, in terms of lack to an Arab Islamic work plan in the face of the Israeli plans. Amid the defeat and the decrease of the national tide national leadership is considering that crisis has stormed the Arab regional regime since 1967. As a result, the Arab countries slipped into, since independence, into the tribal societies, patriarchy, authoritarian or fundamental religious or deeply national mentality. Going back into history and other these movements that naturally derive from tribalism and its patriarchy, dictatorial, authoritarian caused the defeat. The defeat of all Arab armies in all their wars to Israel. Simply, these armies are equipped for internal oppression and to protect the tribal rules, in addition to aggression only on neighbors within regional wars and military coup. The successive defeats by Israel's 48, 56, and 67 will be followed by military coup like that of Egypt 52, Iraq 58, Syria 63, Libya 69. The failure for an regional system based on tribal system, authoritarian tribal system, is natural simply because the national or the main interest is not to stand against Zionism or Israel, but to serve the interests of the tribal. Then the Arab regional security system collapsed as a result of the Iraq invasion to Kuwait. Final, that the Arab states are not based on reasonable institutions to a degree where it is impossible to separate the state from the ruling tribe. Moving to the first and second intifada, which are deemed by al-Naqeeb to be the focal of the regional conflict with that acquired a global dimension. Intifadas within the Palestinian context, which I may disagree, represent a number of new social movements which coincided with the end of the Cold War, and they have many common characteristics like that of 1989 revolution, which was part of the book co-authored with his colleague Adwan. He believes that the Intifada is a perfect, ideal strategy to achieve the demands and the goals of the Palestinian national movements. Yet, it is useless if we look at its impact on the long run. The Intifada is highly effective on the short term as they rely heavily on the presence of media, which make them not only limited to the parameters and boundaries of a single state. In return, they do not succeed if they lack the leadership that are aware of the tools of conflict. Even the first Intifada led to Oslo and will bring about the autonomy rule of municipalities or provinces like that in West Bank. Rather than violence and negotiations, it will be turning into a conflict to break the will and to demoralize the Palestinians, which will cause the Palestinians to offer unlimited sacrifices in the absence of alternatives or other solutions of the leaders calling for total liberation. The breaking of wills, demoralization will take different forms, and the Intifada will be depicted only as acts of violence and as how the October 7 was depicted by the West media as act of violence. Many Arab and Western media are also trying to belittle the Intifada. Resistance in Lebanon, which will compare to the Palestinian resistance, he will consider that of Lebanon has is more solid in ideology, yet the Palestinian resistance was failed by Jordan. Then he will address the realities of certain Arab states living under the Israeli threat. He will consider that Israel, that it will not be able live in peace, and they will be historically contained within the region. He also considered that the inevitable end of these wars, that Israel will melt within the Arab region, yet this requires a certain requirements and conditions, and then I will move to normalization, where al-Naqeeb called to disapprove the conclusions can be summarized in three. First, the literature on Khalid al-Naqib, there is a disregard of the Palestinian cause in his work, also the Arab unity, also the issues of development and backwardness. As to his own works, the Maghreb area is marginalized, if not totally absent in his analysis. Also, the youth who are not strongly manifested in his lecture. The last is how can we address his al-Naqib and his legacy, and how can we employ his production to analyze our reality. I will leave this to the question and answers. Thank you to the panelists. This is a very important presentation. My comment or my discussion with Dr. Al-Farra is in terms of the concept of constructivism. I believe there is a kind of confusion. Constructivism, while Binyawiya is structuralism, and there is a big difference between the two theoretical concepts. Structuralism was based on Bansan's sociology, then developed by others in the anthropology, which is directly linked to the analysis and deconstruction of the structure and other anthropology and micros, which was addressed by Ibn Khaldun. Why structuralism was pushed forward by Bourdieu, and Dr. Farah is aware that Bourdieu, there is a big difference. Structuralism marginalized the role of the actor, while con- constructivism places an argument between the construction and the actor. Here, we you should reconsider the title of the presentation to eliminate any confusion. I have a question. And if you, hello, 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 hello. Can you hear me? Can I go ahead? Thank you, Dr. Christian Dewan, for your presentation. I benefited a lot. I have a comment, and I believe that Dr. Khaldun al-Naqeeb, whose school of thought can be classified into two stages, which is the national spirit, enthusiastic to support the national issue, and after the successive defeats, a more objective approach with respect to the relation between citizenship and tribe. I believe in the early stages of the ideas and thoughts raised by Naqeeb, may he rest in peace, he spoke about the correlation between citizenship and tribes. The more developed the tools of respect of citizenship and the democratic citizenship and the citizenship democracy in Kuwait, which is outstanding, the more tribes will fall into atrophy. The tribe does not necessarily mean the control of a particular tribe, yet the control of the ideology of tribe. He's reciting some verses of poetry. This ideology controls the authoritarian state in the Arab East, including the military states or other regimes in the Gulf states. Another comment on Dr. Al-Farra with respect to the Palestinian cause. We can draw a distinction in Khaldun's perspective, which is a matter that must be considered, being hailing from Iraqi family of al-Naqeeb, which have cultural and political ideology, gave him an outstanding position. That's why he was a leading figure. With respect to the position to the Palestinian cause, we can separate two phases: the total conviction of the possibility to liberate the entire Palestine from the river to the sea, and second, the more realistic or reality where the total liberation is not possible. May he rest in peace, and thank you for this very useful and beneficial symposium. Thank you for both the speakers, Christine and Azadin. I have a problem with terminologies. I came to find this when I started my studies in the West. When you say the word tribe, does not conceived as it is in Arabic. The word tribe in Arabic is totally different. They tribe take their mind to the Red Indians. They go far into. With time, you start to explain the make it light to dub it as clanish politics, where tribe is much more broad. As to fellow Azadin, the issue of the Palestinian cause, as I participated with Dr. Khaldoun in many activities relating to the Palestinian cause through years, and I know to what degree he was committed. Yet, due to successive disappointment, we seek solutions and exit. And when I was about thinking about what to start to write about, I thought of writing about Khaldoun and the Palestinian cause. Yet the Palestinian cause takes a repetitive, realistic aspect, totally different from the theoretical one. One of the good aspects of this symposium that we are celebrating a researcher and sociologist, not a government official or a president or a ruler. This per se is important, and this is a trend which is highly commended. This means that once we are gone, you will do a similar symposium for us. This calls for celebration in addition to other positive aspects of this symposium. Dr. Azadin, thank you for that. You relieved me of speaking of the Palestinian cause in Khaldoun's works. Thank you.
About Khaldoun and Naqeeb in the Western literature, in your field, how he's been read there. Is it a critical sociologist? Is it about citizenship? Because citizenship is a core concept in the Western academia, and it's very central to the discussion. So where do you locate Khaldoun and Naqeeb in the Western paradigm of understanding Arab politics, and also the idea of tribalism, as it has been mentioned by the professor? Thank you.
I'll start with the last question because it's easier. Most of his books haven't been translated. As far as I know, I haven't found them. So the one that is most read, that's translated most read, is State and Society, a New Perspective. I think it has a number of different titles. So this one is really a historical sociology, sort of, which gets at a lot of sort of what I initially talked about different phases, kind of within the Gulf, from an economic perspective of how the shifts, and it gives you kind of a landscape of the Gulf, and then how of tribes as they fit in with the economics of the period, and then thinking more critically, well, the book about the state in the future periods. So I think that's the book that's most read. But then, of course, his other works, I think, work their way through with the scholarship of other scholars that are thinking about his work. So I know that the question of democracy was a really big one, and how to think about that in the Arab context, and how to situate that in terms of a sociology of the Gulf in particular, and broader Arab world. So I think, at least, from my reading, those are the two areas that were most influential, but there's definitely scholars that are looking at other aspects of his work as well. Do you want me to do broader answers too, or just?
Yeah, you can give all your answers.
Oh, all of them at once? Okay. Let me talk a little bit. I wasn't sure, and I apologize because I may not have understood completely all of the argument that was being made, but I think there was an argument about, and I wasn't sure if this is the Khaldoun al-Naqeeb argument or just an argument about an expectation. I think it says that over time, as you get the idea of democratic citizenship, the tribes will fall away and sort of atrophy, or that kind of thinking, or that politics or tribalism will fall into atrophy. Obviously, that hasn't happened, so this is a key question, but yet it has happened, right? I mean, so we see aspects of this happening, and this is something that I was very interested in talking to him about, and that I know that really animated his thinking, at least the period when I met with him. You know, you have to think about the period over time within the oil state in the way that and here when I'm saying tribes, I'm sorry, I'm being very crude about this. Obviously, we're talking about the late arriving tribes that were sedentarized later if we're talking about in Kuwait, in a situation of the more outer districts of Kuwait, that had less access to capital from the state, and got integrated through the state a lot of times through you know, security and services and these sorts of things initially. So I think, of course, over time, the integration within the oil state and the resources of the oil states changes to some degree the mindset of the population. And as Gharam al-Najjar mentioned, we definitely see in Kuwait a period where you know, the leadership of tribes, the tribal leaders, are no longer necessarily controlling elections, and that you have an emergence of people from these districts that are taking in themselves a more economic viewpoint of their status within the state, and deploying much more language of oligarchy and these sorts of things, and making economic arguments about their inclusion in the state and more justice as citizens. But I think the ability for that to have impact depends on these political coalitions. So if you look at somebody like Musal al-Mubarak, who came up a very important figure in Kuwait, you can see that this having more impact when there's a coalition of the Hizb al-Amal al-Shabi, which then you have a coalition between sort of some people from the outer constituencies with Shia and with others, and then when they can make a pitch and argument that can also appeal to more liberal Kuwaitis in the Hadar districts. But those things are also dependent on the political space. So I think it's very complicated. You can't just sort of argue, sort of like in a modernization theory, that the mentality or this will shift over time, and we won't have kind of tribal coalitions anymore. It's mediated by the state and by the resources of the oil that come through the state, which of course is controlled then by ruling families. It's mediated by the politics from below, the institutional structures that structure that, and the kind of then political coalitions and movements that can be built in that. And I know from just my watching in Kuwait and other states, those vary over time, and you can see certain times when those kind of coalesce and sometimes when they don't. But I think that kind of possibility of that, and I think that's where the whole idea, and you know, correct me if I'm wrong thinking about it, of that sort of more, I'm trying to think of even the word that he used, the potential for kind of popular transformation and liberation comes from, and the way that these things interact, or different members of the society interact in reflecting on these political coalitions. So I think that's, all of these things are important to keep in mind. I had one more question. Well, I'll leave it there for now. If I think of it, I'll come back to you.
Dr. Azzuddin?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just say one last thing. Dr. Najjar, when you were talking about the terminology, yeah, I teach Gulf politics for graduate students. And I think you're right, that first step in is really, I try actually to not even use the term often, because it immediately, like, it's just such a powerful, so I'm saying it like takes people in a certain place very quickly. And I think you're right, it's like you need a lot of analytical framework to get people to where they can get around that, and that's why I think like work like al-Naqeeb's is really critical for putting it in a sociological, historical, and economic context where you can start to understand these things and in ways that are more common with politics that we would think of as well. So I take your point, though. I think you were mentioning that you were trying to argue that maybe starting with kind of clannish politics or something in this kind of work might be a better sort of introduction to not get that strong kind of reaction initially. Thank you.
دكتور عز الدين.
البداية دكتور عز الدين. Thank you, Dr. Amal. I took more than 20 minutes in my intervention, but I will make up for that now by taking less time. I thank all my colleagues, Dr. Gironi. When it comes to constructivism, and this is not just Khaldun al-Naqeeb's work. In my epistemological writings, I don't think he was aware. I think he was aware in when he talked about structuralism and constructivism, and which provides a margin for in Bourdieu, there's a problem in translation, and some schools of thought which are different here. Regarding the Palestinian question, I think al-Naqeeb went through two phases. Not just al-Naqeeb, but what it matters in al-Naqeeb's theoretical aspect, at least, he did not engage in the kind of jumping from one position to another like some others have done. What matters to me more is what I said at the end of my intervention, that in the 2011 revolutions, which came to shake the very foundations of the authoritarian state, Khaldun Naqeeb died in 2011, so he didn't have time to come up with the kind of conclusions to understand and study those events. But I think he was banking on the role of the intellectuals and the educated class to liberate our countries from the authoritarian states, and in addition to the role of the youth, also the genocide on Gaza, which has to be linked to the events he focused on, like the defeat of 1967 and the other was. I'm the last speaker, so I'll conclude what Abdulaziz Al-Hais said when he asked about Azmi Bshar's response to Khaldun Naqeeb. Said in his personality, he is a scientist, he is a researcher, he is a free thinker, but he also insisted on remaining a professor and a teacher and a mentor of the youth. I consider myself one of these young people who learned from al-Naqeeb. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now we have the concluding remarks by Dr. Haider. Thank you, Dr. Amal. Ladies and gentlemen, now we've come to the conclusion of this seminar. This is not like our usual events. With our events last a few days with many papers, but nonetheless it was rich in content. In my personal estimation, I think it was ideal to deal with a well-known personality like Dr. Khaldun al-Naqeeb. First of all, Dr. al-Naqeeb is, I defend his position, his ideological makeup. He grew up in a much bigger space than the Gulf. He belonged to the Arab world at large, and therefore I think today's seminar at least clarified the picture a little bit. If you want to write down a typology of the ideas, when the concept of civil society through the person of Khaldun al-Naqeeb appeared, and how the interdisciplinary how he used history, anthropology, the authoritarian state, and what Dr. Kristen has talked about his concept of political tribalism. So in this sense, the 6 papers were ideal. We planned this to have a larger number of participants, but we had, after we printed the booklet, we planned to have 7 papers, Claire Bookbrand, but she apologized in the last minute, so we had to reorganize the sessions. The next step is to publish the papers of this seminar. The book will have more than the 6. There are 2 books, in fact, on Khaldun al-Naqeeb. The first was the Sultan al-Uwais institution. Was published that book about 2 years after his death, and then Yaqub al-Kandari told us about the seminar by Kuwait University in 2022, and in 2024 a book was published which was edited by Dr. Yaqub and Dr. Baqir al-Najjar. We still have gaps we have to fill. Dr. Maryam al-Kuwari was thinking of but she promised to contribute to the book on the political tribalism in Kuwait and Qatar, and Dr. Anud, Dr. Atabi, and others will participate. Dr. Ismail al-Nashif, the summary he gave about Khaldun al-Naqeeb's position will be also a contribution. Dr. Zawawi will have a contribution, but we will still have 2 gaps. The first I'll try to fill, and that is the value of Khaldun al-Naqeeb as a discipline in Gulf studies, and also the project that Dr. Ghanem talked about, the state and society in the Arab world, which was organized by the Arab Center for Arab Unity Studies. It's a book of 5 volumes. I think is one of the most important books of O'Donnell and bureaucracy, etc. Khaldun had to write about the Gulf directly, and in his book about society and state in the Arabian Peninsula, despite my criticisms, I think uh, I think it has moved this field from historical studies to sociological studies, and this needs more elaboration. And what has the book achieved as a discipline? Maybe, maybe Khaldun Naqeeb at that time wasn't aware of a discipline called Gulf Studies, and also Naqeeb as an activist. He is an academic and intellectual, but he has an activist too. I think this way we'll have a book of 10, 11 chapters which will draw a complete picture and can be an addition to the two previous books. I'm sure we will be in touch with you to continue this project, and we hope that the book will be published in 2026. Finally, I just want to thank all those who participated, especially the ones who came from outside Doha, and our colleagues in Qatar, and our colleagues, Dr. Amal, Dr. Marwan, Dr. Ismail, and our unknown soldiers and the technical team, without whose efforts, and Dr. Abdurrahman Ibrahim, Dr. Saeed Al-Hashimi, Abdurrahman Baki, Dr. Anud Al-Khalifa, Yar Nassar, who bore a lot of the efforts, Ibrahim Abdul Jawad, Mahmoud Ntawa, Abdul Mshtawa, Faisal Sawli, and we meet you soon in other events. Thank you very much.